All right, so now here's what we're going to do. We looked at initial burdens of production and burdens of persuasion. Now we're going to look at a level of persuasion. And here, as I said, unless you've dealt with the skeptics, tautological certainty problem, they're just going to say, well, it's still possible to doubt, therefore I have no epistemic duty to commit to that idea. Okay, and again, we'll cover that a little bit more thoroughly in another section. But now, assuming you've dealt with that and people are dealing with the normal standards of proof that you get to in everyday life, and by which really skeptics live by all these levels of proof. Postmodernists live by all these levels of proof. In fact, that's one of the greatest arguments for Christianity is we can live 100% with what we say we believe. Where again, pantheists and atheists and skeptics and postmodernists cannot. Okay, so all that to say, when you look at quantities or levels of proof or persuasion, the issue is when should someone commit to an idea as true? Okay, and this is why, again, it's good to establish this up front with someone, because once you've got somebody, you've covered this and they admit, yeah, I should probably believe it at X. See, then now that they've admitted it up front, it's going to be really hard for them to backtrack and say, no, I'm not convinced now. Okay? It's amazing how much, if you get someone to admit to a proposition up front, it's hard for them to backtrack because they know psychologically they already admitted to it. So it's harder for them to continue to suppress that truth and unrighteousness. That's why you got to be a little sneaky, right? And know up front what to do. So all that to say is we start looking at from the highest to the lowest, okay, levels. We've got at the highest level, we have what's called absolute or tautological certainty. And this means what I've said before. It's impossible to doubt. A unicorn has one horn, a triangle has three sides, okay? That's true by definition. It's quote unquote 100% certain. It's impossible to doubt. Why? Because it's true by definition. And so the problem here is that almost nothing attains to this level of certainty with respect to propositions, except for those type of things I already said. The complete opposite, okay, or the other end of the scale is impossible to know, okay? So when you talk about complete skepticism or complete doubt, it's I can't know anything about it, okay? I can have no level of certainty about it, which of course, there are very few things that would ever fall in that category as well. So everything that we, on a day-to-day basis that we live on is actually going to be based on some of these, based on these different levels and areas. And I'll cover some of the claims as we go along. So yeah, so absolute certainty is one which, again, very few things obtain to. But then the next level down, which is not tautological or absolute certainty, is something that people would call a psychological or intuitive certainty, okay? Where it's still possible to doubt the thing, but there's so much evidence in favor of it that psychologically or intuitively, nobody really thinks about it anymore. And the fact that people who worry about that stuff, we tend to send them to certain kinds of doctors, right? Or counseling for that. An example of that would be, things like, will the sun rise tomorrow? Well, it has every single day I've been alive, and for pretty much every single day that people have been on the earth. It's possible that the sun might not rise tomorrow, or that gravity might not be in effect in the next 3 seconds. All of those things are still possible to doubt, but nobody really thinks about it or gives any concern about it, okay? So that's what we call a psychological or intuitive certainty, which again, we operate on certain claims and certain levels on that basis. But usually when it comes to, by the way, in law, nothing, there's no standard for psychological or intuitive certainty. There's no standard for, again, absolute certainty. Unless you're watching Matlock, where Matlock comes in all the time and says, I'm going to prove beyond all doubt, okay? No, he's not, okay? Nobody proves beyond all doubt except for those things that I mentioned. So the next level, when we start thinking about layers or levels of certainty, if 100% is tautological or absolute certainty, we get to this standard, which is now, we think of, it's the criminal law standard that's used in U.S. courts. And it's proof to a level of persuasion, we were talking to the jury, beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty. Okay? Now, what is that? This means the trier of fact is fully satisfied, entirely convinced, or satisfied to a moral certainty that the fact is true. So practically, the standard represents a high level of conviction that an individual causes him to act in accordance therewith. Now, this is not tautological certainty, but why it's called a moral certainty as well is because you heard all the material and relevant evidence that was presented. You heard in the adversarial system all the counter-arguments, okay, and the things that would make you doubt. And you, as the trier of fact, have considered all of this, and you are convinced that it's just highly, highly probable that this person actually engaged in this behavior and committed the crime. And what's important here is that the moral certainty part is this, is that you have thoroughly thought about the issue, and if it comes up later that this person was actually innocent, you are not morally responsible for putting an innocent person in jail or having their lives taken by capital punishment. That's why we might add to a moral certainty on that, because you would not be morally culpable for being lazy-minded by taking away someone's life or liberty. That's why we have such a high standard for incarceration or capital punishment. So again, for that, that's one of the higher levels. The below that, if you think about a level of proof. Now, if you ever put a percentage on this in a court of law, they'd probably they'd call a mistrial on it, because you're not supposed to give percentages in just about every jurisdiction. But you might want to put this at 70% or beyond a reasonable doubt, or 80% or something like that. But it's not 100%. You're highly convinced to a moral certainty. The next level is what we call clear and convincing, and that might be 60% or 65%. This is a standard that's used in probate cases and sometimes in fraud cases. Where you're going to prove fraud, you have to prove it by clear and convincing. So it's not the regular civil standard, which I'll talk about in a minute, of preponderance of evidence. It's clear and convincing. So clear and convincing is trier of fact is convinced the truth of the fact asserted is highly probable. So where beyond a reasonable doubt is highly, highly probable, but not tautological certain, this is just, yeah, it's pretty probable. It's highly probable, not just more likely than not. It's a little bit more than that, okay? Highly probable. So that's clear and convincing evidence. And so, in other words, the more positive evidence you give for something, and the more you've dealt with all the defeaters and the counter evidence, the more highly probable that fact becomes. So, on that, now we get to probably the most important standard, which I'll talk about because this is it. The civil standard in American courts is what we call preponderance of the evidence, okay? Preponderance of the evidence, that's where you see it just means more likely than not, okay, that it's true, that this fact or this historical event actually occurred. In other words, there's a scale of justice or the weight. If it's 50.01%, it's more likely than not, okay? It just weighs more in favor of yes than no. That's the civil standard. Billions and trillions of dollars are decided on this standard every day, okay? Same thing with, you think about criminal cases. Again, the fact is that people's lives, their liberty, are taken away based on a highly probable standard, not a tautological standard, okay? Again, to a moral certainty. But preponderance of the evidence is important because this is really what you want to make the case for when you have studied theology well. You can present Christianity and the truth of the Christian religion, the gospel of Jesus Christ, well and clear and hopefully efficiently, and that you've given a lot of evidence to that person that it actually corresponds to reality. And that you want to get someone to say, look, if it's simply more likely than not you believe Christianity is true, why would you not commit to it? Because it's more likely true than not. because that's really the minimum standard for committing to an idea, which, by the way, as apologists, the more you study good theology and deal with these apologetic defeaters that are tossing brothers and sisters to and fro by every wave and wind of doctrine. See, you become a Christian at the preponderance of evidence standard. But the more you deal with these defeaters and problematic issues that people raise against the faith, well, guess what? Your level of certainty and commitment goes higher. And now all of a sudden you're doing what? It's like, well, yeah, I'm more convinced it's true than I was, when I first believed. And now I can tell you I've been doing this for 35 years. And frankly, I can say, yeah, I'm at a beyond a reasonable doubt to almost a psychological, intuitive certainty. I don't even think about it anymore on whether Christianity is true, because I've been dealing with apologetics and polemics and this stuff for 35 years. I've had the privilege of doing this. So this is why, as I end this segment, why is that significant? Is because if believers start doubting the faith, then they're less committed to it, which means they're less active in the Christian faith, in worship, in discipleship, and in evangelism. So the more that we, as we say, fill the potholes in the road that leads to the door of the house of salvation with apologetics and with good arguments, this is how we stay highly certain and highly convinced of the truth of Christianity, which is why we need to continue with it. All right, more in the next segment. I'll pick up again on preponderance and kind of show why that's important. And then we'll look at what happens if we're below that 50% standard. What should be the level, what should the action be if we're below 50%? See you next time.